Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the May 2019 Mississippi PowerShell User Group meeting. Tonight we'll be talking about Lean on Me, Managing Dependencies in PowerShell, featuring guest speaker Chris Gardner. Take it away, Chris.
Okay, it's good to be here. It's a little early or late for me, so it's 2:30 in the morning, but we'll see what we can do. So let's talk about some dependency management. So there's a bit of an agenda for this. We want to talk about why it's important, the different types of dependencies. We'll talk about hash requires, required modules, and then PSDepend, which is a little bit of a solution for some of this. So why should we care? So the PowerShell community is wonderful, and we do all sorts of really great things, but we also really love reinventing the wheel. So we have a whole bunch of modules that do all sorts of the same thing. So we've got a bunch of modules for writing HTML from PowerShell. We seem to have a few modules for writing Excel documents, because management love Excel documents. Mostly we've settled on import Excel, which is kind of nice, but we still have a ton of modules out there that all do the same thing in only slightly different ways. So ideally, people would be looking on GitHub or the PowerShell gallery for whether or not there's already a solution to their problem out there, and then if there's not, sure, build a new solution. But otherwise, there's probably better things you can do to contribute to that project rather than necessarily doing it all over again in a slightly different way. The other big thing is lots of companies have security requirements and audits and compliance that they have to go through. So I know a bunch of people like pharmaceutical companies and banks have to say, this is the version of the code we're releasing. It's been vetted, it's been gone through security, everyone's happy with it. This is the code we're stuck with. And going through that process for even small changes is pretty expensive and difficult. So being able to say, yes, this is the version of the code we're using, we're specifying these exact dependencies, they've all been reviewed, everything's happy, means that if you do need to go through reviews again, you can just say, we're still using these same versions of the modules, we're just upgrading our internal code. And you generally get an easier time going through that. And it makes testing a lot easier. Everyone's hopefully writing tests for their code, and if you're not, it might be quite nice to start looking at that. But if you know that you're locked to a specific version of third-party code, you know you don't have to worry about that just randomly changing on you. So we're talking a lot about versions here. So there's a thing called semantic versioning, which is, for the most part, 3-part version numbers, and then you get some extra bits on the end for beta versions, pre-releases, that sort of thing. But it's becoming basically the standard for how the industry does versioning, not just within IT pros, but across software everywhere. Having some sort of versioning scheme is very important, particularly when you're looking at modules. And the basic rules are, don't make a breaking change to your module without major version numbers. And that's quite a broad range of things, but if you look at it from the point of view of things like, if I change whether a parameter isn't mandatory, so now it becomes mandatory, that's potentially a breaking change. If I change the object that a function outputs, that's a breaking change. For smaller things, like fixing some bugs, you increment your patch number. For adding new features which are backwards compatible, you increment your minor version number. And the idea being, you don't change how a user interacts with your module, even if you change the internals. As long as the inputs and outputs are the same, the user shouldn't care. But as soon as you change those inputs or outputs, increment the major version number so the user is aware that there are breaking changes that they have to be aware of and have to review. Only thing to be wary of, though, is if the major version number is a 0, all bets are off. There can be breaking changes in even the minor version changes. You should try to avoid it, but the idea being it's still a pre-release. Don't expect it to be perfect every single release. So with PowerShell gets, in the last couple of versions, it kind of forces you down to three-part versioning. Not directly, but to the new get package file that's produced. So it seems to be my way these days is to use 3 parts rather than 2 parts or 4 parts for versioning. It doesn't make much difference to end users. They care about major.minor for the most part, but still useful to try and be aware of. And you've got to try and make your breaking changes as low impact as possible. I guess if you can add aliases for parameter names, do that if you're going to change them so that people transitioning over to your next major version have a bit of an easier time. So with that covered, dependency types. So for most people, we care about runtime dependencies. It's the stuff I need wherever I'm running this script or file or module to be able to run it. So if I'm running against Active Directory, then I need the Active Directory module installed. If I want to talk to Azure or AWS, I need their modules installed. So these are the runtime dependencies are the main thing you will come across and want to document and be aware of. Build dependencies are becoming more of a thing that we need to care about as we start developing more complex modules and start using some of the software development cycles of using CI/CD pipelines, or we don't really build PowerShell modules as such in the traditional software development ideas, but we do go through a similar process. So having a list of things you need for that process is pretty useful and quite important to have, because it's not just about having them there so you can build it every time. It's having them there so it's documented, so other people coming to the project know what it requires. Particularly with runtime dependencies, if I just run a random script on my machine and go, oh, why is it asking for me for Active Directory? I didn't expect it to need that. It doesn't say it needs that anyway. There's nothing in the README file on GitHub saying it needs that. So having that documented in a sensible way before it gets too far into your script and, wrecks your local machine or kills AD or something, it's useful to have that all covered. So the easiest way to start this off is if we look at scripts, since that's where most of us start writing things, and the way you handle requirements of all sorts of different types is using hash requires, kind of like a comment, but has some special connotations to the PowerShell parser. So the important thing is it has to be the first thing on a line. You can't put other stuff in a comment before it. It has to be hash requires. It can go anywhere in a script as long as it's not inside of a function. But for general visibility and easier skimming reading for people coming at it, generally put them at the top of your script file. You can do things like requiring modules, requiring run as administrator, versions of PowerShell itself, versions of the shell itself, and a bunch of other stuff. So let's have a look at some of these things. See if this works. It helps if we use the correct mouse. So if we have run as admin, that's quite a common one for us to do. I have some random piece of code that I can only run as an administrator because I'm installing some software, uninstalling some software. So if I just jump to my prompt here, I have a normal user prompt, but if I try to run this script, if I try to run this, it says, no, you can't, you're not running as admin, fix that, and then come back to me and try and run me again. So if I swap to my admin prompt, do the same thing, it says, no, you're all right, you're admin, do whatever you need to do in the script. And because this is running before any code in the script and not running any of the code in the script regardless of what it finds, then you know your code is going to be safe to run as a non-admin and isn't going to cause weird side effects. There are some other workarounds that people have done in the past where, similar to how I have my prompt here where it shows me that I'm admin, there's a way to check if you're an admin or not, and people often run that in their code and say, oh, you're not an admin, let's automatically re-prompt you, like relaunch a window as an admin and run the code. That's a little dangerous, but also likely to fail if the user doesn't have permissions to run as admin. So having that catch there, which PowerShell handles for you, means you don't need to run any sort of random bits of code to check for that. It's a simple, nice easy line at the top of your script. So let's look at caring what version of PowerShell we're on. You know, not all of us are lucky enough to run on PowerShell version 3 and above. Some of us are stuck on PowerShell 2. Some of us are not able to use some of the nice things that come in PowerShell 6, for example. So if we have a look in here, so this works because I'm in PowerShell 5.1. I don't have a V2 machine, so I can't prove that it doesn't work in there, but I've got a one here for checking if we're in PowerShell version 6. That's the wrong prompt. So again, this fails saying, sorry, you're not in the right version of PowerShell, you need to be in 6.0 or above. So I go to my PowerShell 6 window here. We're in PowerShell 6, not a problem. But because it's a minimum requirement, not a maximum requirement, or a hard requirement of you can only run this in 6.0, you see this works in 6.2. I hacked PowerShell around a little earlier, so I've built allegedly what is version 7, but it's not, it's just 6 with the version 7 number on. So I can do run the same script and says, yep, works fine because we are in PowerShell 6. Or above. So that can be quite useful if you know that you require features that or commandlets that are already available in higher versions. The common one is things like the new web commandlets that come in PowerShell 6 and above, or if you're doing some stuff with DSC that's only available in PowerShell 4 and above. Some things the engine handles magically for you, things like classes, if you won't work in PowerShell 5, well, will work in PowerShell 5 and above. So PowerShell just figures that out for you and says, sorry, can't load these things. But having that extra way of checking at the top of your scripts can be quite useful. The other one, as was discussed earlier, was when you depend on modules. So if I have a script that uses Active Directory, as I keep saying, and I want to make sure the user's got Active Directory available on their machine, I put a hash requires modules Active Directory, or thread job in this case, is because I don't have AD on my machine. Then, again, it'll kill the script before it gets to that point, but it documents that requirement in a reasonably easy to see place. So if I run this from here, I can see, yep, can't run the script because I'm missing thread job. Jump over to my other box. I can see, yep, that works fine because I have got thread job available. So all of whatever this code would do will work fine. What we can also do is say, depend on multiple different modules. So if I show this example, I can say, make sure I've got Microsoft Teams there, and also that I have PSDepend, but this specific module version, or at least this module version, because we can do module version or required version. It's obviously, one is a minimum version, one is a required specific version. So that doesn't work in core, because I don't have Microsoft Teams installed on this. Whereas if I swap over to my Windows PowerShell window, it takes a little bit of time, but it works. And now if I look, that should have imported Microsoft Teams and PSDepend. So it does the dual job of not running if the modules aren't available and importing those modules so they're there. Not a huge performance difference, but every little helps, so you don't have to have random import module statements throughout your code. If you do have some of the modules available, this will only show you the first one it doesn't have, which is kind of a pain, but usually is prompting enough for users to go, I'll actually have another look at this script and figure out why it requires it or what it requires where. So having that requires at the top of your script makes life a lot easier for everyone because they can just see it straight away, nice plain text. You can also do a few other things with requires, but as always, get help is really helpful. There is an about requires file which tells you the different options that are available. For the most part, you're probably looking at using version, modules, or run as administrator, because PS Edition is usually covered by version, and I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon with the PowerShell 7 announcement. That will still be core. Run as administrator is probably the most common one, and is used. I know I certainly use it in modules as well as in normal scripts, because some things require running as administrator. It means that the entire module requires administrator, but I'm willing to live with that. So there's a big, really useful about help file here. Definitely worth looking at that if you want to have a look at more details on this stuff. So modules now. So with a module, we have this concept of a PSM1 file, which is our actual code for doing stuff, but we then have the module manifest, which is all of the metadata about your module. And in here, we can define required modules. We can also define all of those other things we saw with hash requires, which I will show in a minute. But required modules is the big one that I try to focus on more because it's the main thing we want to make use of in terms of third-party code. You can specify it in a few different ways. You've got the name, what I like to call the short module info, which is basically name plus either module version or required version. So you get those two important bits of information. Or the long module information, which is the same things again, but with a GUID, which is the module GUID. That's really useful because you can decide how explicit you want to be about what version of the module to use, or the third-party module to use. A lot of the time, you probably don't care. You just want, give me the latest version of Pesta, whatever I have installed. Other times you might be, okay, well, I'm using Pesta, but I want to make sure I'm using 4.8 because I know 4.9 has some issues that I can't get around. Other times your security guys are like, we need to make sure exactly this version of this exact module is only being used, in which case you put the GUID in there, you lock it down to a required version of 1.2.0 and say this is the only version of this module we're allowed to use because it's gone through various compliancy checks. PowerShell get is quite helpful in this as well. So if I install a module from the gallery, it will automatically figure out what those required modules are and install them for me if they're not available already. It will check whichever repository you try to install from first and then look to other ones after that. So if a module I'm using is installed on my internal private gallery, but the required modules aren't because they're just from the public gallery, it'll check internally and then swap to externally. So let's have a quick look at that. So again, if you're doing anything with modules, lots of us have PSM1 files which either just pull in a bunch of functions in there or .source functions or however you decide to build your PSM1. But having the PSD1 file is really useful and really important because it has all of this extra data in it. So we say, Yeah, so this is the GUID you'd need for the module info. It's got a bunch of helpful descriptive text for people. So you can see here we can specify minimum PowerShell versions, what the PowerShell host is called. So like if you use the ISE, that's called PowerShell ISE, I believe. You've got console, you've got, I think VS Code has a different name as well. If people write their own custom PowerShell hosts, you can document them there as well as being what versions are required. You can specify a minimum version of the host needed. I don't think I've ever needed to use that. Minimum frameworks for .NET, quite useful because things like the new AZ module requires 4.7.2, I think, or one of the versions did recently. But again, if you're using specific .NET objects, classes, types, that sort of thing, that are only available in newer versions of .NET Framework, put that in there. You can kind of get around that with your PowerShell version. For example, 5 and above is only available on 4.6, I believe. So you can kind of fudge it a little that way, but it can be sometimes useful to document it in both places just to be explicit. CLR version, processor architecture, again, useful things that don't come up very often, but when you need to say this can only ever run on x86, then you can do that. Hopefully that's not too much code, but I've encountered plenty of projects that are still using x86 as their only method of doing things. So here's the required modules. So you can see the different versions. We've got Pesta, basically a case of just make use of this module. I don't care which one it is. Then I'm saying, okay, for the Platypus module, make sure it's at least 0.13.0. Maybe there's some issues in 0.12 that I don't want to deal with, and I don't care as long as it's above that. And then also make use of name it, but it has to be 2.1.0. If it's anything lower or higher, I don't care. This version's been cleared. Let's use that one. You do a few other things in here, like what required assemblies there are, formats to process that I brought this code from, what functions and commandlets and various other bits and pieces to export. But as similar with requires, let's kill that session and reopen it. So similar to hash requires, when I import this module, it will automatically import these modules for me. VS Code's wonderful at the moment because you hit enter a bunch of times. So I wait a few seconds while it imports my module. There's not a lot in there, but because it's loading my dependencies as well, it takes a little bit longer. So now I can see it's brought in, name it 2.1, 4.6 of Pesta, because that's the latest version I apparently have available, and 0.14 of Platypus, because I don't really care as long as it's not below this number. And then my module's imported with its one command of get data, which just lists some data about my machine. If I try to run that in, for example, here, it fails because I don't have a version of Pesta that it'll work with. But again, it tells me that, so I can go, okay, well, why is that? I literally don't have any versions of Pesta. Great. Now I know I can go and fix that. But again, I've got it documented here so that other users can see what's required. And it takes me very little effort to update this and keep it in line with my code as I go through incrementally by checking stuff into source control of some sort. So, sorry. So last thing, this is going a bit quicker than I expected, but okay. How do we handle all these dependencies? Because that's, it's a bit of a pain to make sure we've got everything we need in various places. So that's where a tool like PSDepend comes along. So we can use this to track what dependencies we need and make sure they're available where we need them. So it's basically defined in a PSD1 file to keep things nice and simple for everyone. It's mostly, at least for my uses, in terms of build dependencies. So when I run this code through a CI pipeline, it just installs my various modules like my PSDes, my platypuses, so that they're there for my build process to make use of them. And it can do more than just modules. So this was written by Warren Frame, who's Rambling Cookie Monster all over the internet pretty much. And if you're using source control, which hopefully you are, this lets you just track your dependencies as you go through the iterations. So you might find at the moment we're using a specific version of PSDe, but 6 months later, a bunch of new stuff's come out, and we're like, okay, we've reviewed it, we're happy to take the next version on. So I update my PSDepend file, everything's good. If for some reason I need to rebuild the old version of the code, because the customers come back to me and said, oh, we've got some problems, but I've got version 1 and you've sent me version 2, or I haven't moved to version 2 yet. In that situation, you just run a build against version 1 and the dependencies download as the right version. So it'll handle more than just modules. So if you're doing anything with GitHub or Git repos, it can pull those in. If you've got NuGet packages you need to use, it'll handle those. There's a big list of stuff you can do with it. If I show that in.
Do you know how it works, Chris? I'm just curious. I've never used it before.
It's a mix of things, so I'll show you the PSDepend file.
Because one thing I have in my my module builder is I have something you can give it like a bunch of functions, and it'll scan through there and grab every command letter function and it'll give you a unique list of all the modules that those commands are part of.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. The way this works is you say, these are the things I require, and it goes off and gets them from wherever it can. So obviously some things are kind of obvious with what it wants to get. So in this case, these are all PowerShell modules, so you can tell it what to pass into install module for the various required versions and such. If you're doing stuff with install module, you can say, actually just use save module and save them to this location. But it'll do like Git repos, npm, and a bunch of other stuff. So if I do, yeah, PSDepend.
Yeah, the one I was talking about, I actually use the AST and grab all the commands and get the modules from those. So if somebody doesn't tell you what the dependencies are, you can just it'll just scan the file and determine the dependencies for you.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, it'd be quite useful to have that sort of thing as part of this. But this is more like here's the things I need, and then install them. Again, it's more of a CI pipeline tool rather than a general tool for after that. But yeah, these are the things it'll install or it'll work with. So things like command are just any old command you want, but I think .NET SDK was added recently. But yeah, being able to handle and figure out what dependencies a module has or a bunch of functions have would be quite nice. I might have to have a look at that. Yeah, it's probably not appropriate for this module, but I know a few other places that would quite like to make use of that. And that should be PowerShell Gallery module, of course, because that's where most of this stuff comes from. But you can specify internal repositories if you want to do that. So I have an example here. So this is one of the modules I wrote a while ago. I still need to develop it a bit more, but I've got my dependencies set out, explicit versions for what I need. So all I have to do is do invoke PSDepend going to do force, so it doesn't prompt me. And then it goes off and checks the internet, checks whichever repository I've said look in, and then downloads them all to dependencies. And because I've said add to path, it'll automatically add that folder to my path, so I can use all of those modules without worrying about cluttering up my normal PS module path, installing them as specific users or all users or whatever else I need to worry about. So I can see it's downloaded 131. It makes the whole process of having a build pipeline, as it were, a lot simpler, because I just know, get me these versions of stuff, run the rest of my build script. So in this case, I'm using Sake. Other modules, I just use a build script I've written a while ago and haven't bothered updating. And it just, yeah, if I need to change the version number of my module, that's what configuration does. Run my pest tests. I don't need to care about making sure they're installed on wherever I'm sending this. I just know this script will handle it automatically for me and make sure they're available and not cluttering up my machine. But yeah, as I say, you can do stuff with specific Git repos. So here's some stuff we downloaded from the gallery. If we have a look in here, where is it? Sure, there's one of these. Oh, all of these have been changed to be modules from the gallery. Great. There was some examples using Git repos, but it's a case of just give it a name. So if I went say what location I want it to be. And if I have a PSDepend repository within my GitHub, it'll go, okay, I'll go get that from there. This is all very well documented by Warren on his repository. He goes through how to install it and the different ways you can specify. Oh, that's the format you're supposed to use. So you say what repository, well, what GitHub user it is, what repository, and what branch. So if you need to pull down specific branches, it becomes pretty easy to do that as well. Again, you can explicitly say what type of a dependency it is if you need to. What else is there? On the module manifest stuff that I forgot to mention before, there's a whole bunch of documentation on what you can put in different places in a module manifest. And here's an example of saying, get me this module, this version, and here's the exact GUID for that module, which is pretty useful. So, any questions? Because that was considerably quicker than I was expecting.
If anybody's got any questions, and you have a mic, just feel free to unmute and ask them.
If you don't have a mic,
this is Paul. I've got a question about the PSDepend. So that's really neat that it pulls from GitHub. Can it pull from the public GitHub and an enterprise GitHub? Let's say I pull modules from both locations.
Yep, as long as you have access to it, then it will pull it from anywhere. And it can also just pull from any Git repo that you have access to. So you just give it a URL and just say, get me that repository there with a specific branch, and it'll pull it down. So Warren's got it pretty well documented in here. If I do, I believe it's just called Git. So he's got it. So yeah, you just say, get me something from that, and here's the branch name or the commit ID. I believe it'll handle public and private GitHubs quite easily, or enterprise GitHubs, or whatever else you want. But again, it's all documented on the repo and in the help that comes with the module, which is quite nice because it uses PowerShell help format as well. Although it's not as pretty to look at when you look at it this way.
So, do you think there's ever a reason to set a dependent module for like a built-in module?
Um, Probably not for most of the core stuff. I know they are trying to move some of the things that are less core, shall we say, out to actual external modules that they update independently. So I know like the archive module was recently updated in the gallery. So that's now available there. And if you require that specific version, I'd probably put a required modules for that specific version.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea, I guess. Because and not that the Hyper-V module is built in, but I know there's like two distinct versions of the Hyper-V module, and some
Yep.
work with certain versions of Hyper-V and some don't. So that's a scenario I can think of where you want to specify the version.
Yes, yeah. There's also things like Active Directory module, where there's a whole bunch of different versions of that, which you might say, I know I need to be running on the latest version on like 2016, so this won't run on 2012, sort of thing. Microsoft.PowerShell.archive, I believe.
So about that, with the Active Directory modules, doesn't that require rstat to be installed? I mean, is PSDepend able to install that?
No, it's not, but it's more of a comment on the required module side of things.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. PSDepend can't install it, but at the same time, if you say, I require version 4 of the Active Directory module, which is only available, I'm just guessing, say it's only available on server 2016, but I try to run that script, that module on server 2012, with rstat there, it'll go, sorry, can't run that here. Some of the stuff you need isn't available, or the AD module seems mostly competent at keeping the same throughout the versions, just performance changes and stuff like that from what I can tell. But I don't use the AD module very often, so I'm not sure. So yeah, we can see that the version's there, but if I look on locally, I can see there's a different version installed by default. So if I need some of the extra functionality that comes with the latest version of this module, then yeah. Because even though it's technically a built-in module, it's also not a built-in module anymore. And they are moving more towards this model for some of the other core modules.
One thing I noticed in the help for requires is they show an example where they require a version and then they use a separate requires line for a module. If you scroll
Yes.
and that I don't like that at all because you can do it all in one line.
No, you can't.
Oh, really?
Can you?
Yeah, you can do it in one line. Yeah, I do it all the
Dash
time.
modules, whatever, then dash version. Yeah, I guess you could. I guess it makes it a bit more readable this way, so that people aren't getting confused that you're requiring like version 6 of the Azure M.NET Core module.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
normally I do
Which is-
one requires line and I do everything on one line.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's funny.
yeah.
I actually thought you could only do it on one line.
No, so the weird thing about this is, unless you read the docs, you assume has to be the first thing on a script, has to be like literally the very first lines, but it's not just like chuck it anywhere in your script you want, as long as it's not inside functions. As long as it's as long as it's the first things online, just put it anywhere. But as far as I'm concerned, that makes it considerably less readable, considerably less useful. Whereas if it's at the top of my script, I can see instantly when I first look at something, this is the requirements before I even run it. But yeah, having everything on one line makes a bit of sense. But I can imagine that might confuse people if you're not using like the hash table notation for modules. If they might go, okay, well I need version 6 of that module. But at the same time, if it works for you, great.
I'm glad you brought this up where it can be on different lines because I actually thought it had to be on the first line as well, and I went and
Yeah.
looked at the docs after you said that, and I think maybe some of the confusion comes in because it doesn't have to be on the first line, but it has to be the first thing on whatever line it's on.
Yes.
But the reason I'm glad that I understand that now is so when I take my functions and I go from like a non-monolithic in development design and I roll them up to like everything in the PSM1 for production.
Yeah.
I have a requires in the in the individual functions, but then I strip that out for when I roll it up into the PSM1 file. And I also grab those and make sure that each one of those matches what's in the module manifest in the requires module section.
Okay.
But that's good to know because I'm doing that also with the AST. I'm grabbing just the function, so it's not that I'm really stripping out the requires. I'm just grabbing the function body, so it
Yeah.
doesn't get the requires itself.
Yes, and because they're comments, sort of, you can't grab them with the AST. You have to grab them with the tokenizer. Because I've had that with some of my other scripts I've written where I need to check for comments in certain places, and the AST is just like, I don't know what they are. I don't care. Carry on. But yeah, that catches lots of people out, is the putting the requires everywhere. And I do a similar thing with my modules where I roll everything back up into a PSM1, but I just do a simple get content, add content approach, because most of the time I don't need to worry. But I do like that approach of checking if the requires matches, like the required modules and stuff in the manifest. Might have to do that as well. So any other questions, comments? Anything you think I've missed?
I'm surprised we haven't heard from Joe.
I just wondered, is there a way to cause like put everything like on a file share and then have it look for there? I'm sure this might be something that's not related.
So if you want to put stuff in a file share, you can set up a NuGet repository, which is just an SMB file share, and do install module from the file share. I think that's documented somewhere. It's just basically a NuGet repository, because that's all the PowerShell gallery really is. So you can put that as an SMB share wherever you want on your network, really.
You can do that, but I do know there's some, unless it's changed, because I presented a session on PowerShell Get at the PowerShell Summit when it was in Charlotte several years ago, and the video is still available. But if you do like a find module for, say, Pester, and you've got numerous versions of Pester on that SMB share, it won't return just the newest one by default. It'll actually return all of them by default. So
yes, yeah. I think that's because the various NuGet web servers are a lot more specific on what they return, because they're obviously more intelligent than just some random file share. So generally favor doing an actual web server based NuGet repository, preferably with SSL, because nothing should be on non-SSL these days, considering that certificates are free and doubly free if you have a CA.
You can I mean, a simple version, if you just want a really simple one, NuGet repository, there's one called ProGet, and they have a free version that you can.
Yep, that's the version we use. Yeah.
You can also. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very loud, Joel.
Yeah.
As usual.
I'm very loud. I don't even know what mic I'm using on this computer. I'm very sorry. I was going to say the GitHub and Azure both announced free repos that will work for this.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so GitHub does their new package thing, is private preview at the moment, which you have to opt into, but I think it's only for public projects currently. And Azure DevOps has private ones currently, but will have public soon as well. You choose whichever is most appropriate. I imagine GitHub will have a private package feed as well soon. But we use ProGet because it does caching, which is quite nice, and pass through to the gallery.
Both of those do. The Azure one in particular, why does it say I'm too close to my mic? I'm like 2 feet away. Anyway, the Azure one does pass through now. They do this whole thing on their explanation where if you add an external feed and then you install a package from your feed that came from the external feed, they cache it locally.
Yes. The only problem is it doesn't allow custom NuGet feeds, because I've been playing around with that quite a bit, trying to get it to work, but you can do NuGet.org and you can do custom NPM, but you can't do custom NuGet, which is a real pain. And I need to bug the team about that because I'm sure I've seen it on someone's instance, but I can't remember whose. So I need to prod them to sort that out. Well, if everyone's happy, that's great. And if you got any questions, I did have some slides up with, contact me through GitHub, through Twitter, Slack and Discord. If you're not on Slack or Discord, join us, it's great. And that's my name everywhere.
We certainly appreciate you presenting tonight, and especially with it being, I think you said 2 o'clock.
It's 3, it's 20 past 3 currently.
So
we're going straight to bed.
Well, I was going to ask you, have you been to bed yet?
I didn't want to in case I didn't wake up or didn't sleep properly afterwards, so I was just like, I'll just stay awake. It was a bit easier. But if anyone's got any feedback on this, I'm in the UK.
Whereabouts?
I'm currently living near Leeds.
Okay.
Anyone's got any feedback on this or recommendations and stuff I've missed, please let me know. I'm trying to make this a bit padded out a bit, apparently, because it's not particularly long at the moment. It needs to be a bit longer, I think. But drop me a line on any of these platforms. I'm sure I'm around in other places as well.
I tried to write a blog article this week on what I was telling you about, where I scan the files and get a list of dependencies, because I need to write a blog article on something, and what I was working on is not really panning out, so that might be something interesting.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to read. See how you do that.
Well, one of the things I have is that the servers that I might want to run this on have no way to get to the internet directly. They get patched remotely, or they get patched through like their patch repository, or So, in order to run scripts against the servers, I have to have some way of downloading the module to a SMB share, and then just have it work from there.
So it doesn't have to be an SMB share. It could be a normal NuGet repository that you just host internally, that you then validate modules that go onto it. So I know a bunch of guys who are doing a similar thing where they have to do code reviews on every external dependency they use, and that's usually a manual process to go through, make sure it all works, and then stick that version and only that version, sign it with their internal code signing certs and stuff, and put that on an internal repository. And if they ever want to upgrade to a new version, they go through the whole process again.
Well, it sounds like the great way to do it, but unfortunately I work with the government, and so it's kind of...
Yeah, these people work with Microsoft and others, so they have similar sorts of strict requirements on what they're doing.
So I just put a link in the chat. That'll get you to the video that I did several years ago at the PowerShell Summit, and I installed ProGet and all that during that session. Now, one other thing, I'm going to paste one more link in there. So I will warn you that Microsoft actually made changes to package management and the PowerShell Get module in Windows 10 version 15.11, 16.07, and 17.03, and they didn't increment the module version.
Yes, they're all version 1001 as I recall. That was... I've run into a number of problems with that, and it annoys me to no end that they did that. So I always basically update PowerShell Get first thing I can, because it becomes slightly more usable, but not by much. But I'm sure there are numerous projects ongoing for various people that rewrite PowerShell Get. I think we've all considered it at some point.
Okay, well, thank you again, Chris, and I'm sure you probably need to get some sleep.
Yes, not a problem. It was good speaking for you guys. Thanks for having me.
Have a good night or a good morning.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation.